Take it away, Tim.
Okay, so this, of course, is my first time doing this. I don't, you know what your traditional sort of format is, but I'm just going to plow in with my end of things, if that's okay with you, and give it my go. I will. My only request is that we hold any questions till the end. I'll take some questions if I'm able to answer them. I have no idea, but let's do that at the end so we have time to get through it. As you say, we're rather compressed for time. We had to double the time fitting me in because I had to play the 8:30 service, and we don't want to compete with the 10 o'clock virtual service either. So I'll just launch in. The book that I'm going to talk about is My Sour Sweet Days, which is a collection of poems, 40 poems by the 17th century metaphysical poet George Herbert. And I have no idea what you all, how much you all know about George Herbert. I've gotten emails from some people who'd hardly even heard of him. Some people are scholars of George Herbert. So wherever you happen to fall on that scale. For my own self, I was almost 100% ignorant of him. I've never been a big poetry person, I can't say particularly. But I had been exposed to his poems in the hymnal. Now, one of the things I've tried, and I may do a class on this sometime separately, but one of the things I've tried to impress on people over the years that the Episcopal 1982 hymnal is a treasure trove of poetry and literature. It's not just something you pick up to sing. It's a treasure trove of literature and poetry, some of the finest in the Anglican world. And there are, I should have checked beforehand, but I think there are 6 or 7 hymns in the hymnal, our hymnal 1982, that are poems by George Herbert. And so that was, of course, where I've been exposed to him. Also, if any of you know the 5 mystical songs of Ralph Vaughan Williams, those are poems by George Herbert, some of the best known ones, immaculate settings. If ever there was music worthy of matching poetry like that, it's in those 5 pieces, believe me. So I'd encourage you all to listen to those if you haven't. Some of you are probably familiar with those. So this book, I got and I read through it, and there are a few poems in there that are from the hymnal 1982. The Call is in there, Come My Way, My Truth, My Life. Also, King of Glory, King of Peace, which we usually sing to General Seminary tune, and 1 or 2 others. And so as I was going through this, the author, Mark Oakley, obviously Herbert's the author of the poems, but Mark Oakley is the author of this anthology. He is the Dean of St. John's College, Cambridge, and a visiting lecturer in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, King's College, London. And he was formerly Canon Chancellor of St. Paul's Cathedral, overseeing the arts and learning programs. So this is one accomplished guy, you can tell from his little bio right there. And he put this anthology together, and it's very accessible for someone like myself who is not a Herbert expert. In fact, barely was into poetry at all. He makes what can be rather impenetrable at first, poetry, extremely accessible and extremely easy to understand. And he'll take each poem and then he'll have a couple pages of where he writes a little exposition on it. And the expositions are just incredible. Not only are they able to elucidate on the poetry and also define certain words and phrases that to our modern ears at first glance we have no idea what meant. He puts those in context and does a little translating as is necessary. Not tons of it is required, but sometimes the word usage, and it's 17th century English, Shakespeare period. And so there's sometimes words and phrases that to our modern ears are alien or used differently. And that combined with it already being metaphysical poetry can really make it a little bit daunting to approach at first. And his little expositions just bring it right out into the open and make it very clear. And not only that, a couple other points about how he writes. He not only makes it clear, he adds something to it, but without interpreting it in a certain way. He wants to avoid interpreting these poems. He wants to leave it open for you to interpret. So he makes them understandable and accessible, but he doesn't go off into deep interpretation of his own. He leaves that to you. And also, you can tell he's an excellent priest because he also, these little expositions are like mini sermons. They make the theology of the poems just come alive to a modern reader. It's really quite amazing what he's able to do in these little 2-page expositions on the poems. So just a little background on Herbert before I want to go through and actually read a couple of these poems and his expositions on them to give you an example of what I'm talking about here. But before we do that, let's just go through a little bit of a bio of Herbert, just so you all know basically, you know, the basics of his life. That should be up on your screen right now, the little bio of Herbert. And of course, this is very, you know, I cut and paste off the internet. You know, it's just very, very, very basic stuff. You can, you know, get books and get into it as deep as you want on your own. But for today, just some basics. He was, George Herbert died at age 40 of tuberculosis. And so he actually only became an ordained priest just about 3 years before he died. And so the priest part of his life was really quite at the tail end from everything I'm reading here. And forgive me if any of you are Herbert experts and there's any mistake on here. It's entirely possible, but just bear with me for now. He was born in 1593 in Wales, the fifth son of an eminent Welsh family with great love of the arts. He was he was a very close contemporary of John Donne. His mother had patronage to distinguished literary figures such as Donne, who dedicated his holy sonnets to her. His father died when he was 3 years old, and leaving his mother with 10 children, all of whom she determined to educate and raise as loyal Anglicans. She certainly succeeded with George Herbert. I don't know about the rest of them. His early education was at the Westminster School, and then he won a scholarship to Trinity College in Cambridge, got 2 degrees, as you see there. And then he was appointed reader in rhetoric at Cambridge in 1620, public orator, post he held. He was called upon to represent Cambridge at public occasions, and he really seemed to like that post an awful lot. He was very well connected from everything I've read socially. His 2 immediate predecessors in that office had risen to high positions in the state. He was well connected at court. And during most of his earlier career, he wrote mostly poetry as he needed to in Greek and Latin, as was customary at the time for special occasions and so forth. He resigned his orator post in 1627 and married, took holy orders of the Church of England in 1630, again, just 3 years before he died. And he spent his life as a rector at a little church near Salisbury, and I've seen pictures of it. It's just a nice little stone church. I mean, you'd never imagine that it was any great figure, you know, had necessarily ever, you know, worked there, but there it is. He preached, wrote poetry, and helped rebuild the church out of his own funds. So he was a very, you know, pretty well-connected, socially, pretty high status, well, you know, highly educated guy for his day and age from everything I've read. On his deathbed, he sent a manuscript. Now, the poems that are in this book are from a collection called The Temple. And on his deathbed, Herbert sent the manuscript of his English poems to his close friend, Nicholas Farrar, who was the founder of a semi-monastic monastery and religious community. And he told the guy, publish the poems if you think they're worth anything, otherwise burn them. And fortunately for posterity, they did not get burnt, and they were put into a collection that became very popular and was printed 20 times by 1680. His poems have been characterized by a deep religious devotion, linguistic precision, metrical agility, ingenious use of conceit. Now, there's a term that's very sort of English professor. Owen could explain it a lot better than I could. It's the type of use of extended metaphors. And his poetry is notable for its purity and effectiveness of his choice of words. You can read his poems, and at first glance, to a modern reader like myself, is what in the earth word salad is this? It doesn't make any sense. Then you start to understand it, and with the help of our guide here, then once you think you fully understand it, it seems like you can always pick more out of them. It could be the simplest little word, but nothing seems to be accidental. Even his use of just the most minuscule details, even the number of syllables he uses in a line can have significance. It's really pretty amazing how much richness is in there in these poems, even the simplest ones. They almost all have a different form. That's another thing about his poems. They're almost all of them have a different form. It's pretty amazing. Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote of Herbert's diction that nothing can be more pure, manly, or unaffected. He is ranked with Donne as one of the great metaphysical poets of England. Okay, so that's sort of the background on Herbert and the background on the book. And so what I thought I'd do is I'll take what time we got, I'll go through a poem or two here to give you an example of his poetry and also what Oakley says about it. And then I can take a couple questions before we conclude, if that would be at all helpful. Also note that Owen has written a wonderful review of this publication, and I didn't put it up on the computer, but I'm sure she'd be glad to send that to you as well. And that goes into a lot of good information on the book as well. Very useful. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen because I brought up a couple of poems here. Now, I purposely, especially here for the first one or so, I purposely pulled out poems of his that you may have heard or sung, just sort of give you an idea of what really can be in there. I know I sang this a million times, played it a million times, obviously in church, and I never realized all the richness that really was in there. That can be an issue sometimes when you just sing through them and don't, think deeply about them. That's why I encourage people to, look at the hymnal as a source of literature, not just music, because the music is there to serve the literature. Oftentimes, especially as musicians, we get that backwards. It's a very easy trap to fall into. So let's take a look at this poem. It's called Praise 2. A lot of these poems have little numerals after them, like Prayer 3 or Praise 2, things like that, only because some of the poems that have the same title, but there are several of them with the same title, and so that's where that comes from. So Praise 2. All right, so let's give this a read here. King of glory, King of peace, I will love thee, and that love may never cease. I will move thee. Thou hast granted my request, thou hast heard me. Thou didst note my working breast, thou hast spared me. Wherefore with my utmost art I will sing thee, and the cream of all my heart I will bring thee. Though my sins against me cried, thou didst clear me, and alone when they replied, thou didst hear me. 7 whole days, not one in 7, I will praise thee. In my heart, though not in heaven, I can raise thee. Thou grewest soft and moist with tears, thou relentedst, and when justice called for fears, thou descendest. Small it is in this poor sort to enroll thee, even eternity's too short to extol thee. Now, if you're like me, this poem, it's impossible to read it without thinking the tune of the hymn in your head at the same time. But notice that the penultimate stanza, thou grew soft and moist with tears, that one is not in the hymnal. That one is separate and usually not sung in the common version of the hymn. that we sing. So, an example of Oakley's exposition on these poems, I'm going to read for you. Here he goes. This is him speaking. This is the second of 3 poems that Herbert entitled Praise. Each tends to give voice to the need to honor and celebrate the being of God and the outpouring of God's love in creation, while at the same time admitting how awkward and inappropriate we are when we set about trying to do this. The poem is better known than many of Herbert's because it is often sung as a popular hymn. It has been much appreciated by critics. T.S. Eliot, for instance, applauded its masterly simplicity, and others have similarly enjoyed its low-key ingenuity. In many ways, it is Herbert's attempt at a psalm. It weaves in phrases found in the Psalms and pursues its own style of Hebrew parallelism of sounds and images. God is first addressed as King of Glory, King of Peace. For those who would make God a convenient holy support to human glory, often acquired by the shedding of blood or humiliation of others, the corrective is found here that God is also peaceful and the God of all people, not just the biggest armies or egos. In typical Herbert monosyllables, he says quite simply, I will love thee. And so that God's love will never stop, he also says that he will move, which means appeal to God continually. He says that God has granted his request by hearing his working breast. This refers to prayers that come from the conflicted heart and not the rational head. Herbert tells God that because of this, he will use all his artistry in word and music to praise him as he deserves. Sidebar, Herbert was an accomplished musician. There are often musical metaphors in his poems, often referring to stringed instruments, just FYI. Okay, going on. Herbert is aware of his sins as he prays. They cry against him like the blood of Abel cried against Cain in Genesis. But God settles the debt. Alone, when he is still tormented by the past, God bears with him and hears, soothes, forgives. We live at a permanent crossroads, the point where a past that has affected us and a future which lies open to us meet together in the present. God's loyalty is to the future, not to the past. Herbert is committed to praising God each day and not just on a Sunday. He can raise God, praise him in his heart, but he cannot control God. He knows that God is not a God of revenge and cruelty, but is soft and has tears of pain when those he loves suffer or press their self-destruct buttons and self-hate. When they have failed to love and justice would call them to order and fearfully declare a verdict, God instead steps down from the judge's seat and embraces us in the dock. It is a small thing in the light of eternity for a human being to honor and enroll God. In fact, concludes Herbert, eternity itself is too short to magnify God. We don't use the word magnify much these days, except when thinking of magnifying glasses to make things look bigger. This is what praise of God ultimately seeks to do. True praise makes God bigger, more discernible to us in our lives and in the church, in the world. Humans tend to start to resemble what they worship in life, but by magnifying God, we simply seek to make God and not ourselves the center of our hearts and minds and wills. We seek to deepen our relationship with God in the only way possible, love. Herbert's poem began by praying that love may never cease. Love, Herbert believed, is the sole spiritual imperative and the only law of the authentic soul. So there's an example of the way in which, like I say, each of these little expositions, it's like a mini sermon. It really is. And it not only clarifies meanings and historic details of the poetry, sometimes throwing in a little technical information too, like he mentioned the Hebrew parallelism in this one, but also bringing it around and explaining the pastoral dimensions that apply to us today. One of the traits of Herbert's poems that Oakley comes back to again and again and again and again in this book is that Herbert regards God not as a distant judge or anything like that, but as a friend, Sometimes Herbert even berates God a little bit, gets mad with him, and kind of takes him to task for, why are you putting me through this? Or why aren't you listening to my prayers, and so forth and so on. But God always treats him kindly, as a loving friend would. And it's a very wonderful tone that he's able to take, is considering God as a personal friend in the way he talks to him in these poems. I want to read a second. I could go on all day with all these poems, and I certainly love to. And I put a lot of them up here. Unfortunately, obviously, we won't, for time's sake, be able to get to most of them. But there's one I want to make sure I read to you all before, let's see, before we go to questions or anything. Let's see here if I can find it. Okay, let me find the one I'm after here. Love 3. Okay, let me see if I can get down these. Here it is, just past it. Yes, probably my favorite of them all. This is one that you all have heard if you've listened to the 5 mystical songs. Love 3. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. Nor, obviously, love here is referring to God, and there are lots of Eucharistic overtones. This is actually the final poem in the collection. Herbert makes sure that love gets the last word. And notice some things I really noticed here is that the person, Herbert, complains that he's unworthy, being God's presence, unkind, ungrateful. And God turns that right around and actually says, I'm the one that's going to serve, obviously referring to the crucifixion. And then he goes on to say, and this is very interesting at the end, you must sit down and taste my meat, so I did sit and eat. That love has to be experienced. It's not just an intellectual concept, but has to be tasted, experienced. That was something that Oakley brought out as well when he was going through his exposition of this particular poem. Right. So many voices, this is Oakley speaking, calling us from every side every day, telling us that we are small, fat, ugly, stupid, poor, not of any value unless we dance to the tune of the culture's advertisers. We internalize these voices, believing ourselves to be valueless, but often lash out at others to hide it. Here we find the gospel encapsulated in a few intimately charged lines. Don't listen to the noisy bullying voices because only one matters. The voice that comes from heaven telling you who you really are, that you are loved and wanted and for always. The gospel asks us to live up to this voice and not to live down to the others. The last line in a typical Herbert monosyllabic resolution shows us that the banquet begins when the man finally listens to love and sits with him. No doubt to continue a conversation in which they can now, at last, look into each other's eyes. Most of us think there's something that God must hate about us. Herbert, in this magnificent poem, shows us quite the contrary. God looks at us and loves and then holds out his hand, smiling. When Herbert placed his poems together for his friend to look at, he was careful as to the order in which he placed them. He placed this poem right at the end. The message was clear. For the person of faith, love must be the last word. So there's another example of Oakley's brilliant, explanation and elaboration on the poetry here. And again, they're all like that. The whole book is like that, and it's really made me want to go deeper into the poetry. The poetry is, especially for the time and age in which it was written, it's extraordinarily non-judgmental. It's very accessible, even for people, I can imagine, of wavering faith that don't like, traditional organized religion and so on and so forth, could really find a lot in this poetry. And Oakley also makes a point of that. It's quite amazing how universal it is, given its context and the year it was written. All right, so I'd like to go on more, but we only have a few minutes left. If anyone's got any questions or comments or anything like that, I'd be glad to take them.
Tim, I want to know if you're going to read more poetry now.
Oh, I think I may well, because at least to this guy, I mean, this is really like I say, at first glance it can be so impenetrable, but with just a little bit of elaboration and elucidation, it just comes alive, and that's what this book does. I'll read these again for sure. I mean, these are the kind of poems you could read over and over and over and over and over and get more out of each time. They're very rich that way. Yeah.
And sort of like Shakespeare, I think Herbert's poetry has to be read aloud. You miss it if you don't read it aloud. So thank you for doing that, Tim, because it really was very effective.
Yeah. There's I had up here to do the call. We didn't get to that, but yeah, it's the Come My Way, My Truth, My Life. There's also another one. I won't find it right now, but there's another one that's in the hymnal that's not sung quite as often that's also in there. But yeah, we have quite a few of these in the hymnal 1982 of his poems. Any other questions or comments?
I think you make such a good point about the relativity of these words for today in the spiritual context, because sometimes I think it's just like he says, we get carried away with ourselves. And guess what? People have been praising God and loving God and receiving God's love for centuries, but we think we're the smartest.
Yeah, I love this quote from Oakley in here. He says, God for Herbert is not an object we fuss over and fall out over, but the subject to whom my life must relate most seriously and deeply. God is never the object of our knowledge for him. God is the generous cause of our wonder. That's a very, this guy really has it together with his theology and how he approaches these poems. It's amazing. Each one of them really is a bit of a sermon in his exposition on them. All right.
This was wonderful, Tim. Owen, I'd like a copy of that book review.
Okay, I'll be happy to send it to you, Clarence.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tim.
Yeah,
Wish we had more time. Thank you so much for.
I know. It was just wonderful, and I really think it whets everybody's appetite for that beautiful book.
Yeah,
so.
I highly recommend it for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And as Catherine said, you can get it at the Cathedral Bookstore.
That's right.
See you all in church.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.